In an earlier movie, I suggested that you use your camera's automatic exposure setting so you could focus on your composition. And most of the time, your camera is going to nail the exposure, but not always. Let's spend a few minutes and look at how to fix exposure problems with one of my favorite tools, and that's a plug-in to Photoshop called Camera Raw. Now let's start in Bridge. Now there are three types of images that you will likely use with Camera Raw for teaching and learning, and those are JPEGs, TIFFs, and your camera's native RAW file format, which could also be converted to Adobe's digital negative format or DNG. To ensure that you're opening your images directly in Camera Raw, right or control click on one of your images and then select Open in Camera Raw. Now there's a lot going on inside of this tool, but for this movie, we're only going to focus on the exposure options here in the right-hand panel. Now, at the top of the panel is a histogram that represents the dark areas of your image on the left and the lighter areas of your image on the right. The height of each of these curves represents the intensity and the number of pixels at each of those areas. The colored regions represent the red, green, and blue channels, and the gray represents an overlay of all three of those colors. Below are a bunch of sliders that allow you to essentially adjust the balance of each of those parameters in your final image. Let's begin with the exposure slider. When you drag this slider to the right, watch the histogram. All of the values shift more to the right and the image becomes overall lighter or more exposed. Drag that slider to the left and the values all shift towards black and the image becomes less exposed. Now we're looking for a balanced image, and since this image starts off a bit overexposed, let's drag the exposure a bit to the left. I think to a setting of about 1.5 stops feels about right. Now this image has a lot of very dark areas in the coat and a lot of very light areas in the sky. We can see that represented here in the histogram because we have a large spike here on the left-hand side, which represents the coat, and a bunching up of spikes here on the right, which represents all of the sky. Let's pull those in towards the middle a bit more by adjusting the contrast. Now, if you drag the contrast slider to the right, it'll push all those peaks out towards the edges. If you pull that slider to the left, it'll move those peaks down in towards the center a bit more. For this image, I think a contrast setting of about -50 seems to be about right. Next, we'll want to adjust our shadows and highlights. If you look at the histogram, see how we're still seeing a bunching up of these values here near the left-hand edge. Let's push those a bit more towards the middle by lifting the shadows up to the right. If you look at the image as you do this, when you move pretty far to the right, you'll see we're lightening up the coat quite a bit and we're starting to reveal a bit more detail. But if we go too far, we're getting some artifacting. So let's dial that back to about +40. For the highlights, if you lift those up, we'll quickly lose the background. So let's pull those down a bit to fill in a little more color in the sky. I think a setting of about -10 seems to work pretty well for the highlights. Next, let's set our black and white sliders. If you drag the black slider to the left, watch the histogram, and you can quickly see that end spike rise up as you clip the blacks. Dragging that back to the right here, and you can still see that we've got some clipping going on in the red channel. But again, if we drag too far over, we're once again picking up that artifacting. So in this case, I think a little bit of clipping is okay. So we'll dial this setting back to about +10. Now for the whites, we can lift those up quite a bit. Let's go for a setting of about +30. Now that our shot is more or less balanced, let's adjust the overall color temperature of the light to set the mood for this shot. Now this first slider here adjusts the overall color temperature from cool blue on the left to warm yellow light on the right. Now as you drag this slider to the left into the blue, watch the image and notice how it quickly takes on a colder feel to it. Drag the slider to the right to warm that shot up and give it a bit more of a sunset feel. Now for this image, I like to warm the shot up just a little bit and bring it up to about 5800. Now the values here correspond to the temperature settings in your camera's white balance tool and are measured in degrees Kelvin. You can further refine the light quality using the tint slider here, and I'll add a touch more warmth by dragging this slider to the right just a little bit to +10 to add just a touch more magenta to the shot. Okay, we're almost there. Just 3 more sliders down here near the bottom. Next up is clarity. Now, this is kind of an image sharpening slider. Dragging this slider to the right will add more clarity to the image, and you'll see lots of really sharp details coming out. Dragging it to the left, and the image softens a bit and takes on more of a dreamlike appearance. Now, for this image, I like that dreamlike look to really showcase the blue marble. So let's dial this in to about -30. Now, the vibrant slider is going to dull the image if you drag it to the left, and it's going to make the image really pop as you drag it to the right. But with this slider, a little goes a really long way, and I think a setting of about +10 really starts to liven this image up a bit. Finally is the saturation slider. Now think of this as the overall volume control for your colors in your image. Dragging it to the left will really subdue the image, and dragging it to the right will really wake those colors up. Again, a little here goes a really long way, and for this image, I think a setting of about +8 feels about right. Now to see how far we've come, you can click this toggle current settings on and off icon. Now here's where we started, and here's where we ended up. Now, the last step is to open your image up in Photoshop, and you do that by clicking the Open Image button here at the bottom of the panel. And you're now ready to go and make additional changes in Photoshop. Balancing an image exposure is an iterative and deliberate process. You'll likely need to go back and forth between many of the settings that we looked at, making fine adjustments to find the right balance that works for you and your image.